January 3rd, 2026, 2:01 a.m. Caracas, Venezuela. The lights go dark across an entire capital city. 150 American warplanes descend from 20 different bases across the Western Hemisphere. And in exactly 2 hours and 28 minutes, a sitting president will be dragged from his bedroom and flown to New York City in handcuffs. This is not fiction. This is not Hollywood. This is Operation Absolute Resolve, the most audacious military operation since the raid that killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan 15 years ago. Operation Absolute Resolve, the midnight raid that captured a president. But here's what the mainstream media isn't telling you. This operation almost failed 3 times. Weather delays that forced postponements. Intelligence gaps that nearly compromised the entire mission. A Venezuelan president who slept in a different location every single night to avoid exactly this scenario. And a steel-reinforced panic room that could have turned this precision strike into a catastrophic failure. So how did Delta Force, America's most elite special operations unit, pull off what military strategists are now calling one of the most complicated and exquisite operations in modern warfare history? Before we begin, I need to explain why we're creating this documentary today. While the world has moved on to other headlines, the implications of Operation Absolute Resolve are still unfolding. This wasn't just the capture of one man. This was a fundamental shift in how nations exercise power in the 21st century. And the full story, pieced together from declassified military briefings, intelligence reports, eyewitness accounts, and international investigations, has never been told in its complete form until now. We've spent weeks researching every available source to bring you the most comprehensive analysis of this operation. If you appreciate in-depth investigative journalism that goes beyond surface-level reporting, please subscribe to Nkeoma Documentary TV and hit the notification bell. And if you believe this story deserves to reach a wider audience, share this video. The YouTube algorithm will only spread this documentary if you engage with it, and this is a story the world needs to understand. Now, let's begin at the beginning. Act 1. The Narco-President. To understand Operation Absolute Resolve, you must first understand the man they were hunting, Nicolás Maduro Moros. To his supporters, he was the rightful heir to Hugo Chávez's Bolivarian revolution, a champion fighting American imperialism and protecting Venezuela's poor. To his opponents, he was an authoritarian dictator who destroyed one of South America's wealthiest nations through corruption and mismanagement. But to the United States government, he was something else entirely, the world's most powerful narco-terrorist. In August 2025, the U.S. Department of Justice increased the bounty on Maduro's head to $50 million. This made him one of the most wanted men on earth, not for disputed election results, not for human rights violations, but for what prosecutors called his leadership of the Cartel of the Suns, U.S. Intelligence agencies believed Maduro wasn't merely running a government. He was operating a vast criminal enterprise that funneled hundreds of tons of cocaine through Venezuela into the United States every year. The Drug Enforcement Administration had been building their case for over a decade, meticulously documenting connections between high-ranking Venezuelan officials and international drug trafficking networks. By mid-2025, federal prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to secure an indictment, but this created an unprecedented problem. How do you arrest a sitting head of state? Maduro commanded Venezuela's military. He controlled the intelligence services. He had thousands of loyal troops, Russian-trained bodyguards, and Cuban intelligence advisors protecting him around the clock. His compound at Fort Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex, was described by U.S. military planners as fortress-like, with multiple layers of security, steel-reinforced structures, and a dedicated panic room that could withstand sustained assault. Traditional law enforcement was impossible. Diplomatic solutions had been exhausted, and waiting for a political transition could take years if it happened at all. The answer, when it came, was audacious. A military operation so precisely planned, so overwhelmingly executed, that Maduro would be in American custody before Venezuelan forces could mount an effective response. But planning such an operation would require months of preparation, billions of dollars in military assets, and intelligence so precise that operators would know not just which building Maduro slept in, but which room, which bed, and exactly how many seconds they had before he could reach his panic room. This is how they did it. Act 2. The Invisible Buildup. August 2025. While international media focused on Venezuela's disputed presidential election and the political crisis surrounding opposition candidate Edmundo González, something else was happening beneath the surface. The United States was quietly assembling the most powerful military strike force deployed in Latin America since the invasion of Panama in 1989. On November 15, 2025, the USS Gerald R. Ford, America's newest and most technologically advanced aircraft carrier, arrived in the Caribbean. Officially, this was described as a routine deployment for counter-narcotics operations and regional security cooperation. But military analysts immediately recognized something unusual. The Ford had been accompanied by a full carrier strike group, including guided missile cruisers, destroyers, and attack submarines. Simultaneously, Air Force F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters began landing at restored air bases in Puerto Rico. F-22 Raptors, the world's most advanced air superiority fighters, deployed to undisclosed locations throughout the Caribbean. B-1 Lancer strategic bombers, capable of delivering massive ordnance over intercontinental distances, moved into position at forward operating bases. The Pentagon announced the creation of Joint Task Force Southern Spear, ostensibly to coordinate enhanced counter-drug trafficking operations in cooperation with regional partners. What they didn't announce was that Southern Spear's actual purpose was to build the command and control infrastructure necessary to coordinate a complex, multi-domain military operation across an entire theater. By early December 2025, military officials later confirmed all the pieces were in position. Over 20 different military installations were involved. More than 150 aircraft had been pre-positioned. Thousands of personnel were on standby. But the most critical element wasn't visible from satellites or naval reconnaissance. A small CIA team had infiltrated Venezuela. The intelligence war. Intelligence collection for Operation Absolute Resolve represented one of the most sophisticated human intelligence operations the CIA had conducted in decades. The challenge was formidable. Nicolás Maduro was paranoid about American assassination attempts. He varied his schedule unpredictably. He slept in multiple locations: Fort Tiuna, private residences, secure government facilities, rotating between them without discernible pattern. He used decoy motorcades. He limited his inner circle to family members and long-time loyalists who had been with him since the Chavez era. Standard signals intelligence intercepting communications had limited value. Maduro's security detail used Russian-supplied encrypted communication systems. They changed protocols frequently. They operated under the assumption that American intelligence agencies were constantly attempting to penetrate their networks. The CIA needed something better, a human source with direct access to Maduro's daily movements. Sources familiar with the operation suggest that by late summer 2025, American intelligence had successfully recruited someone inside Maduro's inner circle. The exact identity remains classified, but this individual had access to extraordinarily detailed information: Maduro's sleeping locations for specific dates, the internal layout of his residences, his personal security arrangements, even reportedly the names of his pets. This intelligence was supplemented by technical collection. The U.S. National Security Agency conducted extensive signals intelligence mapping of Venezuelan military communications networks. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency used satellite reconnaissance to create detailed three-dimensional maps of target locations. Unmanned aerial vehicles, including the highly classified RQ-170 Sentinel stealth drone, conducted persistent surveillance over northern Venezuela, documenting everything from air defense positions to daily patterns of life around Maduro's known locations. By early December, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane would later confirm U.S. intelligence could answer the seemingly impossible question: Where will Nicolás Maduro be on a specific date and time? The answer for January 3rd, 2026. Fortuna, second floor bedroom, eastern wing. But knowing where Maduro would be was only the beginning. The rehearsal. Somewhere in the United States, the exact location remains classified. Military contractors built a perfect replica of Maduro's Fortuna compound. This wasn't a simple mock-up. Using intelligence collected over months, builders recreated the compound down to minute details, the exact dimensions of rooms, the thickness of walls, placement of doors and windows, the location of steel reinforcements, even the configuration of furniture based on surveillance photographs. President Trump would later describe what his forces had constructed. They actually built a house which was identical to the one they went into, with all the same steel all over the place. Delta Force operators rehearsed the raid repeatedly on this replica. They practiced the approach, the breach sequence, the room-clearing procedures. They timed how long it would take to move from the landing zone to Maduro's bedroom. They calculated the exact number of seconds Maduro would need to reach his panic room, and they practiced moving faster. 12 seconds. That was the window. From the moment Delta Force breached the outer perimeter to the moment Maduro's bedroom door was kicked open, only 12 seconds could elapse. Any longer, and he might seal himself inside a steel-reinforced vault that could withstand sustained assault for hours. Military strategists call this mission rehearsal. Delta Force operators practiced the Fortuna raid an estimated 50 times, refining every movement, anticipating every potential complication, until the operation became muscle memory. Meanwhile, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, rehearsed their portion, flying helicopter assault forces at extreme low altitude through mountainous terrain, at night, in contested airspace, while coordinating with fixed-wing aircraft providing air, support and suppression of enemy air defenses. By late December, the force was ready. But Mother Nature had other plans. The weather delays. December 24, 2025. President Trump authorized Operation Absolute Resolve to proceed. The intelligence was solid. The rehearsals were complete. Military planners recommended executing the raid on Christmas Eve, when Venezuelan security forces might be at reduced manning and alertness. And then severe weather systems moved across the Caribbean. Low-pressure systems generated powerful storms. Cloud cover over the mountains separating Venezuela's coast from Caracas became impenetrable. Visibility dropped to near-zero conditions. The complex aerial operation requiring precise coordination between helicopters, flying at extreme low altitude and fixed-wing aircraft conducting suppression strikes became impossible. The mission was postponed. Military planners attempted to launch again on New Year's Day. Same result, Caribbean weather patterns refused to cooperate. B-1 bombers turned back before reaching Venezuelan airspace. The operation was scrubbed for a second time. Each delay increased risk exponentially. Every day that passed was another day Venezuelan intelligence might detect unusual American military activity. Another day the CIA's human source inside Maduro's circle might be discovered. Another day Maduro might change his routine, sleep in a different location, alter his security arrangements. Finally, on January 2, 2026, military meteorologists identified a narrow weather window, not ideal conditions, not perfect, but flyable. General Kane would later describe it as a path that only the most skilled aviators in the world could maneuver through ocean, mountain, low-cloud ceilings. At 10:46 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on January 2nd, President Donald Trump transmitted his final authorization to the Combined Strike Force. Good luck and Godspeed. Operation Absolute Resolve was launched. Act 3. The Symphony of Violence. What occurred over the next 3 hours represented one of the most complex joint military operations conducted since the Second Gulf War. This wasn't a single raid. It was a coordinated campaign across multiple domains: air, sea, cyber, and ground, synchronized with precision timing to achieve a single objective: capture Nicolás Maduro before Venezuelan forces could mount an effective response. At approximately 11 p.m. Eastern Time, aircraft began launching from 20 different bases across the Western Hemisphere. From the USS Gerald R. Ford, F/A-18E, F Super Hornet strike fighters, and EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft. From Puerto Rico, F-35A Lightning II stealth multi-role fighters. From undisclosed locations, F-22 Raptor air superiority fighters. From forward operating bases, B-1B Lancer strategic bombers. From the USS Iwo Jima amphibious ready group, MH-60M Black Hawk and MH-47G Chinook helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment carrying Delta Force, operators and Department of Justice law enforcement personnel. Supporting this aerial armada, KC-135 Stratotanker and KC-46 Pegasus aerial refueling aircraft, E-2D Advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning and control aircraft, and multiple unmanned aerial vehicles, including MQ-9 Reaper armed drones and RQ-170 Sentinel stealth reconnaissance platforms. 150 aircraft, 20 launch points, all converging on a single target area in Caracas, Venezuela. Military analysts would later describe this level of coordination as extraordinary. Every aircraft had to be precisely positioned in three-dimensional airspace, deconflicted to avoid collisions, coordinated to achieve effects in proper sequence, and synchronized to support the ground assault force arriving at exactly 2:01 a.m. Caracas time. The youngest American service member participating in Operation Absolute Resolve was 20 years old. The oldest was 49. And at 1:30 a.m. Caracas time, the attack began. Lights out. Venezuelan military radar operators monitoring northern airspace noticed nothing unusual. Air defense batteries protecting Caracas were at normal readiness levels. Communication networks connecting military command centers functioned normally. And then, in a coordinated sequence that had been planned for months, everything stopped working. Radar screens went blank, communication systems failed. Venezuelan military commanders, attempting to contact subordinate units, found their radios producing only static. Air defense missile batteries designed to detect and engage incoming aircraft suddenly had no targets to track. This was the cyber attack. The U.S. National Security Agency, U.S. Cyber Command, and CIA technical specialists had spent months mapping Venezuela's digital infrastructure, every power grid node, every communications hub, every radar installation, every military network. They had identified vulnerabilities, prepared access points, and developed cyber weapons specifically designed to disable Venezuela's command and control infrastructure at the critical moment. When the operation began, those cyber weapons deployed. Power grids serving northern Venezuela experienced cascading failures. Telecommunications networks crashed. Military encrypted communication systems were jammed by sophisticated electronic warfare. Venezuelan commanders found themselves blind, deaf, and unable to coordinate any response. Simultaneously, the kinetic attack commenced. F-35 stealth fighters, designed specifically for suppression of enemy air defenses, began engaging Venezuelan air defense systems. Using precision-guided munitions, they targeted Russian-supplied Buk medium-range surface-to-air missile systems, radar installations, command posts. B-1 Lancer bombers struck critical infrastructure, military airfields, fuel depots, ammunition storage facilities. Not to destroy Venezuela's military capability, that wasn't the objective, but to prevent any organized response while the ground force completed its mission. Venezuelans across Caracas reported hearing massive explosions. Port facilities erupted in flames. Military bases came under bombardment. The port of La Guaira, Venezuela's largest seaport, was struck multiple times. Smoke billowed over the coastal areas visible from Caracas. One civilian, Linda Unamumo, later described the experience. "Even up until a little while ago, I was still crying. The explosion was so strong, it destroyed the roof of my house. I had to leave with my daughter, with my family. It was really traumatic." But while Venezuelans scrambled to understand what was happening, while military commanders attempted unsuccessfully to communicate with their units, while air defense operators stared at blank radar screens, the helicopters were already inbound, 100 feet above the water. The Night Stalkers fly like no other pilots in the world. MH-60M Black Hawks and MH-47G Chinook helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment crossed into Venezuelan airspace at an altitude of 100 feet above the Caribbean Sea. Flying this low serves two purposes. It keeps the helicopters below most radar detection, and it masks their approach using the radar clutter generated by ocean waves. But flying at 100 feet, at night, in marginal weather conditions, through mountainous terrain, represents one of the most dangerous forms of aviation in existence. The Night Stalkers navigate using advanced night vision systems, terrain-following radar, and GPS precision navigation. Their pilots are trained to fly in conditions where most military aviators would refuse to operate. They specialize in what the military calls high-risk insertion, delivering special operations forces into heavily defended territory under cover of darkness. As the helicopter formation approached the Venezuelan coast, they climbed to clear the coastal mountain range separating the Caribbean from Caracas. This was the most vulnerable phase. Higher altitude made them more visible to any surviving radar systems, and the mountainous terrain created dangerous wind patterns and limited emergency landing options. F-22 Raptors flew overhead, ready to engage any Venezuelan aircraft that managed to take off. EA-18G Growlers continued jamming any attempt by Venezuelan air defense systems to track the inbound helicopters. E-2D Hawkeyes coordinated the entire airspace, ensuring every aircraft stayed precisely where it needed to be. And aboard the helicopters, Delta Force operators conducted final equipment checks, weapons loaded, night vision systems tested, communications verified, medical trauma kits accessible. They had rehearsed this raid 50 times. They knew the plan. They knew the layout of Maduro's compound. They knew they had 12 seconds. At 1:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2:01 a.m. Caracas local time, the helicopters arrived at Fort Tiuna. 12 seconds. Fort Tiuna is not merely a residence. It is Venezuela's largest military complex, a vast installation housing military headquarters, barracks, command centers, and the personal compound where Maduro slept that night. The helicopters didn't land. Delta Force doctrine for contested insertions emphasizes speed over stealth. The helicopters hovered at rooftop level, while operators fast roped down, sliding down thick ropes from heights of 30 to 50 feet, carrying full combat equipment. The moment boots touched ground, Venezuelan security forces opened fire. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions. Maduro's personal security detail, Russian-trained elite troops, had been alerted by the explosions across Caracas and were prepared for some kind of attack, though they didn't yet understand that the objective was Maduro himself. The helicopters returned fire with overwhelming force. Door-mounted M134 miniguns, capable of firing up to 6,000 rounds per minute, suppressed Venezuelan positions. One MH-60M Black Hawk took hits from ground fire. Rounds penetrated the fuselage. But the aircraft remained flyable, a testament to the Night Stalkers' combat-hardened aircraft maintenance and the skill of pilots flying damaged helicopters under fire. On the ground, Delta Force operators moved with precision born from months of rehearsal. They knew this compound. They had practiced clearing these exact rooms, navigating these exact corridors, breaching these exact doors. Multiple Venezuelan guards were neutralized in rapid succession. Security checkpoints were overrun. The outer perimeter was secured within 90 seconds. And then the assault team reached the inner residence. The bedroom door, second floor, eastern wing, exactly where intelligence had predicted Maduro would be. The breach team stacked outside the door. Explosive charges were unnecessary. Speed mattered more than stealth at this point, and the entire compound knew Americans had arrived. A heavy boot struck the door just below the lock mechanism. The door frame shattered. And there, inside, stood Nicolás Maduro, in a grey Nike tracksuit. He was 12 feet from his panic room, 12 feet from a steel-reinforced vault that would have turned this precision raid into a prolonged siege, potentially with American casualties. But 12 feet was too far. Delta Force operators tackled him to the ground. Flex cuffs secured his wrists behind his back. In the adjacent room, his wife Cilia Flores was similarly detained without resistance. The entire sequence from helicopter arrival to Maduro in custody had taken less than 4 minutes. President Trump, watching via secure live video feed from Mar-a-Lago, saw it happen in real time. We got him. But the mission was only half complete. Exfiltration under fire. Capturing Maduro was the objective. Getting out alive was the challenge. Venezuelan military forces were mobilizing. The initial shock and confusion created by the cyber attack and airstrikes were wearing off. Commanders who had managed to reach subordinate units using runners or backup communication systems were issuing orders. Quick reaction forces were moving toward Fort Tiuna. And inside the compound, Cuban military advisors, 32 of them, later confirmed by Cuba's government, were preparing to fight. Cuba had maintained close military and intelligence ties with Venezuela for decades. Cuban personnel provided security assistance, intelligence support, and advisory services to Maduro's government. When American helicopters assaulted Fort Tiuna, those Cuban advisors recognized this as an existential threat, not just to Maduro, but to Cuba's strategic position in Latin America. They fought back. The exfiltration turned into a running gun battle. Delta Force operators, now carrying 2 high-value prisoners, fought their way back to the landing zone while under continuous fire from multiple directions. Overhead, attack helicopters and armed drones provided suppressive fire, engaging any Venezuelan or Cuban forces attempting to interfere with the extraction. 7 American service members were wounded during this phase of the operation. 2 sustained injuries serious enough to require extended medical treatment. 5 recovered from their wounds within days. But remarkably, no American fatalities occurred. The ground force couldn't be evacuated using the same helicopters that had inserted them. Those aircraft were already damaged and low on fuel. Fresh helicopters from the USS Iwo Jima flew in to extract the assault force. While they loaded personnel, F/A-18 Super Hornets and armed MQ-9 Reaper drones circled overhead, engaging any threats that emerged. Venezuelan official casualty figures would later claim over 100 killed during Operation Absolute Resolve. Cuba confirmed 32 Cuban personnel died. The actual number, including civilian casualties caught in the crossfire, may never be fully known. At 3:29 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4:29 a.m. Caracas time, the final American helicopter crossed back over Venezuelan airspace into international waters. Total time on target, 2 hours and 28 minutes. Aboard the USS Iwo Jima, Nicolás Maduro sat blindfolded, wearing soundproof headphones to prevent him from gathering intelligence about the ship's operations or communications. He held a plastic water bottle. A photograph of this moment, posted by President Trump on social media, would become one of the defining images of 2026. The most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere was now a prisoner of the United States. Act 4, The World Reacts. Dawn broke over Caracas on January 3, 2026, to reveal a city in shock. Smoke still billowed from military installations across the capital. The port of La Guaira smoldered, and Venezuelan state television broadcast an emergency address from Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, surrounded by military officials, declaring herself acting president and demanding Maduro's immediate release. This was an act of kidnapping, Rodriguez stated, her voice controlled but tense. Nicolás Maduro is the one and only legitimate president of Venezuela. We demand the United States confirm he and Cilia Flores are alive and return them immediately. But the reaction inside Venezuela was far from unified. In some neighborhoods of Caracas, Maduro's supporters took to the streets in protest. Pro-government motorcycle gangs called colectivos patrolled certain districts, burning American flags, chanting anti-imperialist slogans. United Socialist Party of Venezuela officials called for mass mobilization to demand Maduro's release. In other areas, however, there was silence, a tense, uncertain quiet as Venezuelans stayed indoors, unsure whether to celebrate, mourn, or fear what came next. Many Venezuelans, even those who despised Maduro, felt deeply conflicted about foreign military forces invading their capital and kidnapping their president, regardless of his crimes. One Caracas resident, identified only as Jaime, expressed the ambivalence many felt. "I don't know if I should be happy because I don't like Trump's tone. He continues with his theory that we stole his oil, and it sets a terrible precedent." But thousands of miles away, in cities across the world where Venezuelan exiles had fled, the reaction was unambiguous celebration. The diaspora celebrates. Miami, Florida. By mid-morning on January 3rd, tens of thousands of Venezuelans flooded the streets of Doral, a neighborhood sometimes called Doralzuela due to its massive Venezuelan population. They waved Venezuelan flags. They embraced strangers. They cried tears of relief and joy. They chanted one word, over and over: Libertad, 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 freedom. Outside the El Arapazo restaurant, a cultural hub for Venezuelan expatriates, one man held a handmade sign with Libertad scrawled in black marker. Another dressed as President Trump, handing out fake dollar bills as symbolic rewards for Maduro's capture. Alejandra Arrieta, who had left Venezuela in 1997, told reporters, "We're like everybody. It's a combination of feelings. Of course, there's fears, there's excitement. There's so many years that we've been waiting for this. Something had to happen in Venezuela." The celebrations weren't confined to Miami. In Santiago, Chile, Venezuelan exiles poured into the streets, dancing and singing. In Lima, Peru, crowds gathered at Miguel de Cervantes Park near the Venezuelan embassy. In Madrid, Spain, thousands assembled in the Puerta del Sol square under a massive Christmas tree, hugging strangers, celebrating what many saw as liberation. One Venezuelan woman dressed as Donald Trump distributed fake money to the crowd. A 26-year-old delivery worker described partying until dawn at a bar hung with Venezuelan flags. "I'm very, very happy. They finally captured that dictator." These reactions reflected the scale of Venezuela's humanitarian catastrophe. Since Maduro took power in 2013, approximately 8 million Venezuelans, roughly a quarter of the entire population, had fled the country. The United Nations classified it as one of the world's largest displacement crises, comparable to Syria and Afghanistan. Hyperinflation had destroyed the economy. Food shortages forced families to skip meals. Medicine became unavailable. Political opposition was crushed. Thousands of political prisoners languished in detention centers where human rights organizations documented systematic torture. For millions of Venezuelans living abroad, Operation Absolute Resolve wasn't imperialism, it was hope. But not everyone shared that perspective. International condemnation. Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement within hours. The United States committed an act of armed aggression against Venezuela, which gives rise to deep concern and warrants condemnation. This is a grave violation of sovereignty and international law. The pretexts used to justify these actions are untenable. China's foreign ministry called the operation a blatant use of force against a sovereign state. Such hegemonic acts seriously violate international law and Venezuela's sovereignty and threaten peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean region. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session. Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated he was deeply alarmed and expressed concern that the rules of international law have not been respected. Throughout Latin America, reactions divided along ideological lines. Colombian President Gustavo Petro, a former guerrilla fighter, condemned the operation and mobilized security forces along the Colombia-Venezuela border in anticipation of refugee flows. When President Trump later made comments interpreted as threats toward Colombia, Petro responded forcefully. "I swore never to touch a weapon again since the Peace Pact of 1989, but for the homeland I would take up arms." Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva wrote a lengthy condemnation. The bombings on Venezuelan territory and the capture of its president cross an unacceptable line. These acts represent a grave affront to Venezuela's sovereignty and yet another extremely dangerous precedent for the entire international community. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum quoted the United Nations Charter. The members of the organization, in their international relations, shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. But other Latin American leaders offered more measured or even supportive responses. Panamanian President José Raúl Mulino stated, "My government reiterates our position in favor of democratic trials and in favor of accepting the legitimate wishes of the Venezuelan people, as expressed emphatically at the polls, where Edmundo González was elected." Ecuadorian President Daniel Noboa issued a stark warning to other regional strongmen. "To all the narco-chavista criminals, your time is coming." European reactions varied widely. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer took a cautious position. "I always say and believe we should uphold international law, but I think at this stage in a fast-moving situation, let's establish the facts and take it from there." French President Emmanuel Macron praised the removal of the Maduro dictatorship, calling for Venezuelan opposition leader Edmundo González to oversee a peaceful democratic transition. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez attempted to balance moral and legal concerns. Spain did not recognize the Maduro regime. But neither will it recognize an intervention that violates international law and pushes the region toward a horizon of uncertainty and belligerence. The global debate exposed fundamental tensions about sovereignty, intervention, and the use of force in international relations, questions without easy answers. Maduro, in Manhattan. January 5, 2026. Lower Manhattan, Federal Court. Nicolás Maduro, former president of Venezuela, stood before a federal judge in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. The same man who had once commanded a nation's military, controlled billions in oil revenue, and hosted state visits from world leaders, now faced American prosecutors as a common criminal defendant. The charges: conspiracy to import cocaine into the United States, narco-terrorism, conspiracy to use and carry machine guns and destructive devices. Maduro pleaded not guilty to all charges. His attorney argued the entire operation constituted an illegal kidnapping, that the United States had no jurisdiction to prosecute a foreign head of state, and that the military action violated international law. Federal prosecutors countered that Maduro had forfeited any claim to diplomatic immunity through his alleged leadership of a transnational criminal organization. The legal battle was expected to take years. But while lawyers debated jurisdiction and immunity in Manhattan courtrooms, the real consequences of Operation Absolute Resolve were unfolding in Venezuela itself. The new Venezuela. Within days of Maduro's capture, the calculus in Caracas shifted dramatically. Acting President Delcy Rodriguez, facing the reality that Maduro would not be returning and that the United States possessed overwhelming military superiority in the region, began releasing political prisoners. On January 8, 9 prisoners were freed, including Spanish-Venezuelan activist Rocío San Miguel, who had been detained since February 2024. President Trump responded positively. "They've been great. Everything we've wanted, they've given us." On January 9th, Trump announced he had cancelled a planned second wave of military strikes due to Venezuelan cooperation. Over the following weeks, approximately 300 political prisoners were released from Venezuelan detention centers. Though human rights organizations noted this represented only a fraction of the estimated 800 still held. More significantly, Venezuela's government began fundamental economic reforms. On January 14th, the United States announced completion of the first sale of Venezuelan oil, valued at $500 million, as part of a $2 billion oil supply agreement between the two governments. By January 20th, Venezuela had received the first $300 million payment. On January 29th, Delcy Rodriguez signed legislation allowing private foreign companies to control production and sale of Venezuelan oil, a dramatic reversal of decades of state control over the nation's petroleum industry. The economic implications were staggering. Venezuela sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves. For years, international sanctions and economic mismanagement had prevented Venezuela from fully exploiting this resource. The new agreements promised to transform Venezuela's economy while providing the United States with a major new oil supply. International oil markets reacted calmly. Despite initial fears of price spikes, crude oil prices increased only 1% following the operation. Analysts noted that Venezuela represented approximately 1% of global supply, and high production by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil meant the market could easily absorb any temporary disruptions. Meanwhile, Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who had won the Nobel Peace Prize and whom many Venezuelans viewed as the legitimate victor of the 2024 presidential election, met privately with President Trump, multiple U.S. senators. She presented her Nobel medal to Trump and discussed Venezuela's political future, though her exact role in any transition government remained undefined. The situation stabilized, but fundamental questions remained unanswered. Conclusion: a new world order? Operation Absolute Resolve did not merely remove one controversial leader, it established a precedent with profound implications for international relations in the 21st century. For the first time since the Cold War, the United States had used military force to capture a sitting head of state, transport him across international borders without his government's consent, and place him on trial in American courts. Legal scholars debated whether this violated the United Nations Charter's prohibition on the use of force against the territorial integrity of sovereign states. The Trump administration argued that Operation Absolute Resolve constituted a law enforcement action, not an act of war, and that the president possessed inherent constitutional authority to conduct such operations against international criminals. Critics countered that accepting this precedent would fundamentally undermine the principle of sovereignty. If the United States could unilaterally decide to arrest foreign leaders it deemed criminals, what would prevent other powerful nations from doing the same? Could China claim the right to capture foreign officials it accused of terrorism? Could Russia justify similar operations against leaders of neighboring states? The debate was not merely academic. Operation Absolute Resolve demonstrated that in an era of precision intelligence, overwhelming technological superiority, and sophisticated special operations forces, traditional concepts of sovereignty and territorial integrity could be rendered nearly meaningless. No location was truly safe. No leader was untouchable. If the United States could extract a president from the heart of his own capital, protected by thousands of troops, defended by sophisticated air defense systems, surrounded by allied nations, if all of that could be penetrated in less than 3 hours, then the calculations of power had fundamentally changed. Some viewed this as a triumph of American military capability and a necessary response to transnational criminal networks that hide behind sovereign immunity. Others saw it as a dangerous return to an era when powerful nations could invade weaker states with impunity. For the 8 million Venezuelans who had fled economic collapse, political persecution, and humanitarian catastrophe during Maduro's 13-year rule, the operation represented something simpler: justice, however imperfect. For Venezuelan civilians who experienced the terror of explosions across their capital, who saw foreign soldiers in their streets, who lost family members in the crossfire, the operation felt like violation, regardless of Maduro's crimes. And for military strategists worldwide, Operation Absolute Resolve became a case study in modern warfare. The integration of cyber operations, precision airstrikes, special operations raids, and intelligence collection into a synchronized campaign, achieving strategic objectives without sustained ground combat. History will debate the wisdom and legality of Operation Absolute Resolve for decades. But one conclusion is inescapable. January 3, 2026 marked a fundamental shift in how nations exercise power in the modern world. The old rules, the assumptions about sovereignty, diplomatic immunity, and the limits of military intervention have been rewritten. And in this new era, as President Trump's operation demonstrated, no one is beyond reach. This was Operation Absolute Resolve, the midnight raid that captured a president, the military operation that changed history, and the precedent that will shape international relations for generations to come. If you've watched this far, you've just experienced the most comprehensive analysis of Operation Absolute Resolve available anywhere. While mainstream media gave you sound bites, we gave you the complete story, the intelligence failures, the weather delays, the 12-second window that determined success or failure, the global implications that will reshape power dynamics for decades. This is what Nkeoma Documentary TV does differently. We don't chase headlines, we investigate deeply, we connect dots others miss. We provide context that transforms news into understanding. But here's the reality. YouTube's algorithm will only recommend this documentary if you engage with it. Every subscription tells YouTube this content matters. Every like signals quality. Every share expands our reach. Every comment, even a single word, tells the algorithm that viewers care about this story. So if you believe in-depth investigative journalism deserves to exist, subscribe to Nkeoma Documentary TV right now and hit the notification bell. If you think this story needs to reach a wider audience, share this video on every platform you use. And drop a comment below. Tell us what surprised you most about Operation Absolute Resolve, or what questions you still have about this extraordinary operation. The mainstream media has already moved on to the next crisis, but the implications of what happened on January 3rd, 2026 are still unfolding. And we're going to continue investigating this story as new information emerges. This is Nkeoma Documentary TV, the Good One documentary, where we go deeper than the headlines. Thank you for watching.